Elena's fingers gripped the steering wheel of her silver crossover so tightly that her knuckles turned a porcelain white, mirroring the stark, unnatural light of the flickering street lamps. The neon sign of the Sapphire Sands Motel hummed with a low electric buzz, casting a sickly indigo glow over the cracked, rain-slicked pavement of the parking lot. It was barely 6:30 on a Tuesday evening, a time usually reserved for the mundane rhythms of suburban life, but for Elena, the world had suddenly narrowed into a sharp, suffocating point of absolute terror. Just seconds earlier, as she had stepped out of room 112, shielding her face with a heavy silk scarf despite the lingering humidity, she had seen it. A dark charcoal SUV turning slowly out of the lot. It was a vehicle she knew intimately. The slight dent in the rear bumper from a minor grocery store mishap, the specific tint of the windows they had chosen together, the way the headlights cut through the gloom with a familiar, piercing blue. It was Julian's car. The realization hit her like a physical blow to the solar plexus, knocking the wind from her lungs and leaving a metallic, bitter taste of copper in her mouth. She didn't dare look back at the room she had just vacated, nor did she think of Marcus, the man she had left behind inside those beige synthetic walls. Her only impulse was survival, a desperate, animalistic need to reach their house in Oak Creek before he did, to somehow weave a lie that could bridge the catastrophic gap between her presence at a seedy roadside motel and the devoted, loyal wife he believed her to be. Her breath came in shallow, jagged gasps as she fumbled with the ignition, her vision blurring at the edges with the sheer force of her escalating adrenaline. The drive toward the quiet, manicured cul-de-sac of Willow Creek Estates felt like a descent into a fever dream. Every red light was an agonizing eternity, every pedestrian a potential witness to the secret she carried beneath her skin like a slow-acting poison. For months, Elena had moved through her life as a master architect of shadows, meticulously building a secondary existence that stood in direct, silent opposition to the one she shared with Julian. The deception had started small: a lingering glance at a former colleague, an extra hour claimed at the community library, a password change on her phone that she had dismissively labeled as a routine security update. But lies, she discovered too late, had a gravity of their own. They pulled at the fabric of her daily reality until the beautiful, stable life she had built over 12 years felt like a thin costume she put on every morning to hide the rot. As she navigated the winding suburban roads, the weight of that duplicity pressed down on her chest, heavy and cold like a slab of mountain stone. She remembered the warmth of Julian's hand on her shoulder just that morning, the way he had kissed her forehead and told her he would be late at the firm. The memory now felt like a searing brand against her conscience. How had she allowed the shallow, fleeting thrill of the illicit to override the sanctuary of their marriage? The affair hadn't been born out of a lack of love for Julian, but rather a selfish, restless curiosity, a desire to be someone other than the woman who balanced the household accounts and planned neighborhood dinners. Now, that curiosity had transformed into a monster that threatened to consume everything she held dear. She wiped a stray, hot tear from her cheek, her hands still trembling violently against the leather of the wheel, praying that the car she had seen was merely a cruel coincidence, a phantom conjured by her own burgeoning guilt. When Elena finally turned onto their street, her heart hammered a frantic, uneven rhythm against her sternum. She scanned the driveway of their colonial-style home, half expecting to see Julian's SUV parked there, waiting like a silent accusation. But the driveway was empty, the dark asphalt glistening under the pale moon. A small, hysterical burst of relief flared in her chest, only to be extinguished by an even deeper, more primal sense of unease. The house looked different tonight. The porch light, which Julian always left on if he knew she was out late, was dark, leaving the front of the building in a deep, funereal shadow. Usually, Julian was home by now, the warm glow of the kitchen window signaling his presence as he prepared a simple dinner or scrolled through the evening news. Tonight, the windows were dark and hollow, staring back at her like the sightless eyes of a ghost. She parked her car, her movements stiff and robotic, and walked toward the front door with feet that felt like lead. The air was unnervingly still. Even the neighbor's golden retriever, who usually barked at the slightest disturbance in the wind, was silent and hidden. As she turned the key in the lock, the metallic click sounded unnaturally loud in the heavy evening air. Stepping inside, she was met not with the comforting scent of home, the cedarwood candles and the faint aroma of roasted coffee, but with a chilling, sterile void. The hallway was perfectly tidy, every ornament in its place, yet it felt utterly abandoned, as if the life had been surgically drained out of the rooms in the few hours she had been away. "Julian?" she called out, her voice cracking and thin in the vast silence. There was no answer, only the rhythmic, mocking ticking of the grandfather clock in the study, marking the final seconds of a life that was rapidly and irrevocably unraveling. She moved toward the kitchen, her footsteps echoing on the polished hardwood floors with a haunting resonance. On the granite island, where they usually left grocery lists, colorful magnets, or spare sets of keys, sat a single cream-colored envelope. Her name was written on the front in Julian's precise, architectural script, the same handwriting that had filled 100 birthday cards, anniversary letters, and loving post-it notes over the years. Elena reached for it, her fingers feeling numb and disconnected from her shivering body. Inside, there were no histrionics, no frantic outbursts of rage, and no messy ink blots born of tears. There was only the devastating, icy clarity of a man who had finally seen behind the curtain of her lies. Julian explained, with a hauntingly calm and detached tone, that he had known about the affair for weeks. He had noticed the way she pulled away from his gentle touch, the way her eyes never quite met his during their morning coffee, and the way her phone had become a permanent, guarded extension of her hand. He hadn't followed her tonight by accident or whim. He had followed her to confirm the agonizing truth he already knew deep in his soul. He described the moment he saw her walk into that motel room, and how the last shred of his hope had vanished in the dim, neon light of the parking lot. But the most crushing part of the letter wasn't the revelation of his knowledge. It was the clinical finality of his departure. He hadn't just left for the evening to clear his troubled head. While she was with Marcus, Julian had been at the house with a professional moving crew he had prearranged days ago. He had taken his clothes, his collection of rare books, his grandfather's vintage watch, and the dog. He had emptied his half of their shared life with a surgical precision that left absolutely no room for negotiation, apology, or a second chance. He wrote that he would not be seeking an explanation because no words could ever repair the fundamental, jagged breakage of her betrayal. He was gone, and he was never coming back. The letter slipped from Elena's nerveless fingers, fluttering to the cold floor like a fallen leaf in autumn. She stood paralyzed in the center of the silent kitchen, the reality of her new existence crashing down around her in suffocating waves of isolation. She ran to the master bedroom, her breath hitching in her throat, and flung open the heavy closet doors with a desperate prayer. The sight was more jarring than any physical blow she could imagine. Julian's side of the walk-in closet was a cavernous, echoing void. The wooden hangers clattered against one another in the draft, empty and mocking. His shoes, which usually lined the floor in neat, polished rows, were gone, leaving behind only small, haunting indentations in the plush carpet. The dresser was cleared of his cologne, his watchbox, and his comb. Even the framed photo of their wedding day that had sat on his nightstand for a decade was missing, leaving a pale, rectangular ghost of dust where it had once rested. The silence of the house grew louder, a deafening roar of absence that made her ears ring and her head throb. She realized then that she had lost infinitely more than just a husband. She had lost the very foundation of her identity. For years, she had defined herself through the lens of their partnership, through the safety and unyielding security of Julian's unwavering love. In her pursuit of a fleeting, shallow excitement, she had traded a fortress for a glass house, and then thrown the first stone herself. There would be no late-night phone call to fix this, no tearful reconciliation in the driveway, and no middle ground to inhabit. Julian was a man of his word, and his word tonight was final. She sank slowly onto the edge of the bed, the mattress feeling vast and unnaturally cold, and buried her face in her trembling hands. The crushing weight of her betrayal was no longer a secret burden she carried. It was the only thing left in the empty room. Outside, the world continued to turn, neighbors sat down to dinner, and the moon climbed higher into the sky. But for Elena, the light had been permanently extinguished, leaving her alone in the wreckage of a life she had destroyed with her own 2 hands. There was nothing left to say, nothing left to hide, and no one left to listen.